Good morning. It's good to be back at the Good Summit. And one of the very good things that has happened since we were last here is the fact that Jules Hamilton got himself a wife. So I'm sure you'll want to join me in just taking a moment to express your congratulations to Jules and Rona, who's hiding down the back. Let's give them a round of applause. Now, as Julian has already explained, I get to talk to these people fairly regularly, but this is your opportunity to talk to the people in power about the things that matter to you, and we hope you're going to avail of that opportunity throughout the morning. But while you collect your thoughts and think about what you might want to ask, let me just add my welcome to our panel today. Leo Varadkar once described her as cranky, but that's not been my experience. She got her own back, of course. She went viral when, during an interview with me, she later described Leo Varadkar as smarmy. But I'm sure we'll have much more pleasant conversation this morning. It's the Sinn Féin leader, Mary Lou McDonald. And alongside her, Ireland's finest cricketer. Well, I'm guessing that on the basis of how often this government sends him out to bat on difficult issues like Brexit, it is the Fine Gael TD, Neil Richmond. Neil, thanks for being with us. And you can see on screen another man who will be familiar to you, the eventual winner of the DUP's game of musical chairs back in the spring. It's the DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, joining us from Westminster this morning. So let me just kick off at the Good Summit by asking each of our panel in just a couple of minutes to tell us what brought them into the business of politics, because it feels like a pretty polarizing business right now. Is there still some good in it, Mary Lou?
Well, good morning, everybody, and happy birthday, Jules, and congratulations on your nuptials to you and Rona. Yes, there is. And I actually came into this life because I wanted to be active in and about and around things that matter. And that's the sum of it. I mean, I think maybe there are people in the world who plan methodically their life journey, you know, from Montessori onwards, and, you know, they desperately want to be a doctor or a mathematician or a plumber or whatever the case may be. That wasn't the case for me. I actually studied here. This is my alma mater. And through my life, I have always gone with things that I believed in, things that interested me, things that challenged me. And politics and activism does all of those things. And I think not alone is there some positivity in it, David. I think there is, as Jules said, an absolute necessity for us to be awake, to be alive, to be engaged, and each in our own way, and from our different perspectives, to make a difference. And ultimately, that's what politics is about. And you see all the toing and froing, smarmy and cranky, and I probably am a bit cranky at times, if I'm to be perfectly honest. But you see all of the theatre of that, and that's part and parcel of a democratic discourse. That matters. The parliamentary cut and thrust is about accountability. It's the marketplace of ideas. It's about putting us through our paces and holding us to account. But beneath that, there's a whole range of work that goes on that's unseen and that's less dramatic, but in many ways much, much more important. So politics matters, activism matters even more. And I believe that, you know, I'm now the mother of an adult daughter, believe it or not, David, since I saw you. I now have an 18-year-old adult. Imagine that. I don't know how that happened. And my son is coming up along, and I say to them, as parents say to their kids, whatever it is, find your star and follow it. Make a difference, because that's how we're going to make progress, particularly on our own island, but also globally. So I'm a believer in this life, even though it's tough at times.
Don't feel too bad. I have a 24-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old granddaughter since we last met.
Okay, so I'm catching up with you.
Life moves on. Neil, does this mean that people like Mary Lou McDonald can be friends with people like Neil Richmond? What goes on behind the scenes in politics?
I really hope so. And if it meant that we couldn't be, then I wouldn't be in politics. And I think the thing about the three of us on this platform is we're all actually in politics for the same reason. We're all trying to make people's lives better. We just are trying to do it in different ways. And that doesn't mean that we're good or bad or right or wrong all the time. It just means that we're part of a process that is a fundamentally good process. And I never intended to be a politician. I can actually remember the exact moment I decided to get involved in party politics. As the really cool, trendy 19-year-old student, I decided to join Young Fine Gael, always, exactly where the life of the soul of the party on campus is. And we just had a really bad general election in 2002 in Fine Gael. No family background in politics. I'd made the decision I was going to vote for Fine Gael. They had a really bad election, actually a little bit better than the last election we had, but these things happen in politics. And spent the summer giving out to my friends when we were interrailing around Europe. And one of them said, I've had 5 weeks of this, I'm sick of it. Would you ever go do something about it? And Freshers Week, second year college, I didn't get the points to get into Trinity, unfortunately, Mary Lou, but I went to the sign-up desk, and that was nearly 20 years ago today.
So, both for the very same reason, really, to make a difference, to do your best to make a difference. So Jeffrey Donaldson, I hope, is with us and can hear us. He's not with us in person because he may be asking questions of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson at PMQ shortly. But Sir Jeffrey, what brought you into politics?
Well, good morning, David. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Good morning to Mary Lou and to Neil, and happy birthday to Jules as well. It's good to be able to join you. Apologies that I can't be in Dublin in person, but as you've explained, David, I've got Northern Ireland questions in the House of Commons at 11:30, and I have a question for the Prime Minister at 12 o'clock. So short of a TARDIS to get me between Dublin and London in a very short time, I'm afraid I have to be in London. What brought me into politics, and is politics still a good thing? I've been in politics now for longer than I care to remember. I joined the Young Unionist movement at the age of 18 because I felt that with the troubles in Northern Ireland, the violence and the conflict, that I wanted to do something to make a difference. And I reckoned that politics was the best way of doing that. And I've been involved ever since. I was elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly at the age of 22. And I've been an MP for almost 25 years. And I still believe that being in politics makes a difference. And when I look at the journey we've been on in Northern Ireland and on this island over the last 20 to 30 years, I can see the difference that politics has made. For sure, we do not live in a perfect society, far from it. But the childhood that I had, and in my youth, when members of my family were killed in the Troubles, people that I knew, friends that I grew up with, lost their lives, to where we are now, where my children are significantly older than Mary Lou's, but they've grown up in a Northern Ireland that is relatively peaceful. They've been able to do many of the normal things that I couldn't do during my childhood. And I believe that the combined efforts of politicians across the political divide in Northern Ireland and across this island, and indeed these islands, has made a difference. Flawed, imperfect though it is, I think that what we have today is infinitely better than the kind of Northern Ireland that I grew up in over 40 years ago.
We've been talking to some of the young people as they've been coming in, some of the students coming into this event, and I'm fascinated by the fact that the issues that seem to matter to you are very often not the issues that our politicians are talking about. So we will come to your issues in a moment, but I'm a journalist, so I'm going to ask the tough questions of the day at the beginning about the issues of the day, and obviously one of those is the difficulty that still exists over Brexit and the protocol. Sir Jeffrey, your party criticised Sinn Féin for threatening to collapse power sharing in Northern Ireland over Irish language rights, but you're now threatening to do it over the Northern Ireland protocol. Does that sound like good politics to you?
Well, we're in a situation at the moment which clearly, for us, is doing a lot of harm to Northern Ireland. The Irish Sea border that has been created between Great Britain and Northern Ireland damages our relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom, despite the fact that the Good Friday Agreement says that Northern Ireland will remain an integral part of the UK for as long as that is the wish of the people. Of course, I don't want to be in a situation where I have to withdraw my ministers from the executive. We are committed to making power sharing work. But what I can't do, David, is implement a protocol that harms one of the fundamental relationships that is covered by the Good Friday Agreement, namely the relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And it is harming that relationship. There isn't a single unionist elected representative in Northern Ireland who supports this protocol and who wants to see this Irish Sea border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We believe it is possible to find an alternative solution that avoids a hard border on the island, that differentiates between goods travelling within the United Kingdom and staying within the UK and those goods that are travelling into the EU. Now, we're working with others to try and find that solution. I hope we can find the solution to that problem. But I can't sustain a situation where my ministers are being required to implement a protocol that is so fundamentally harmful to our relationship with the rest of the UK, because I believe that actually breaches one of the fundamental principles of the Good Friday Agreement.
Mary Lou, I've got to ask the same question of you. Obviously, just yesterday, Michelle O'Neill, the Deputy First Minister, was critical of the DUP for threatening devolution during a pandemic. But isn't that exactly what your party did over Irish language?
Well, I very much hope that we will see Ocht Gaeilge and the language legislation at last come through Parliament in the next couple of weeks. And that was a long-running saga. And just to say, whether it's language rights or other matters, it's a really important thing in public life, and particularly in a power sharing, a really unique power sharing arrangement that we have in the North, that when we sign off on agreements, that we implement them. That's always been my ask of Jeffrey and Edwin before him and Arlene and all of his predecessors. And I hope that we can get to that point where rationally we argue the bit, we negotiate, we agree, and then we implement. That's the only rational way that we can do business. The problem here, with all due respect to Jeffrey, isn't the protocol. The problem is Brexit. And with the greatest of respect to the DUP and others, they were champions for Brexit. They were advised consistently that Brexit would be a disaster for this island, and it is. And by the way, I say this as somebody who would have a fairly sharp critique of the European project, as you know. But whatever the shortfalls of the European project and the direction in which it's travelling, a Tory Brexit was never the answer. The British state, as they do, held out firm and negotiated and played hardball with the European institutions literally to the 11th hour. And that meant then when the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, which, by the way, Boris Johnson's government signed off on and ratified, said it was oven ready, if I recall, it meant that all of that happened very late in the day. So it didn't give what would have been the very desirable breathing space for business, for society to kind of acclimatise and get ready. I think I have to say this. Jeffrey does not speak for the majority in the north of Ireland on the matter of the protocol. He speaks for himself and he claims to speak for wider unionism. But the truth is that in successive votes in the Assembly, MLAs have made it very clear by a majority that they support the protocol, that they recognise the need for it. I think all of us as reasonable people also accept that there are difficulties in implementing it, and we're all game ball for sorting that out. We have a joint committee in which these matters can be resolved. I believe that Sefcovic, the Vice President of the Commission, when he came, and Jeffrey and I were in the meeting with him in Belfast some number of weeks back, came in a very constructive mindset, said very clearly that there are answers to these dilemmas. There are solutions, but unfortunately, I think that some within unionism are preparing for elections in reality in the summer or before and creating that kind of platform. But whatever their motives, we need to be clear here that a majority of elected people in the north recognise the need for the protocol, support the protocol. Business recognises that we have to support the all-island economy, which, by the way, has spiked. It's booming now, and that's a very, very good thing. Everyone thinks so, bar, it seems, the Tories. So if there's any ambition to say that we will get rid of the protocol, that is deeply misguided. That's not going to happen. And I don't believe that withdrawing from the institutions is the way forward. Jeffrey knows that we are ready to work with unionism, even though that can be extremely challenging. And I don't think anybody should be surprised by that. But when Brexit happened, we had to have mitigations. We had to have protections for the island of Ireland to protect jobs and livelihoods and to build prosperity on the island. So, Geoffrey, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, you might accept that your stance on Brexit was wrong, because it has been very damaging for Ireland. In any event, the protocol is here, and now the challenge for us is to make it work. And I believe that the European institutions have come at this incredibly constructively. I think unionism needs to now match that, but more importantly, the British government needs to match that. And then we need to get back to business and we need to crack on, because there's very serious work to be done.
Geoffrey, I'll let you come back in a moment on whether or not you have any regrets about backing Brexit. But Neil, you're obviously very familiar with the protocol as well. You've often done media interviews for the government on this issue. If the EU is now prepared to remove up to 80% of checks, doesn't that beg the question, why were those checks necessary in the first place? Doesn't it create a sense that the EU was punishing the UK at Northern Ireland's expense because of Brexit?
No, far from it, and we can't forget that the protocol, the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement are a joint product of the EU and the British government. No one has single ownership of this. Plenty of people have ownership over Brexit, and I'm certainly not one of them. But I think what you had was the European Commission taking a very reasonable stance of going to actually talk and engage and listen to the business people, the political leaders and the community leaders in Northern Ireland to say, well, how is this impacting you? How can we make it work better? Can't make it work perfectly, because Brexit is ensuring that nothing's working perfectly, and we just have to look at the petrol forecourts or rivers in England to see that Brexit's having a pretty bad impact over there. Northern Ireland and this entire island can be safeguarded from that through the protocol. And again, I think it's down to all of us to engage and not lose ourselves and bring this into wider discussions and wider debates and say, well, how do we make life better for everyone on this island? And I believe fundamentally that the protocol is that best vehicle.
Geoffrey, someone sent me a clip recently from a talk I gave at a college in New York in 2015 when a student in the audience who happened to be from Ireland asked if I thought we would see Irish unity in my lifetime. I said I wasn't sure we would, unless the UK took the head staggers, voted to leave the EU, and there was a change in the shape of Europe. Now, I'm not a prophet, but I could see that coming. How could the DUP not see that there was going to be a potential difficulty with Brexit in terms of the union?
Well, I don't think the difficulty with Brexit is in terms of the union, David. The difficulty with Brexit is that because we all agreed there shouldn't be a hard border on the island, the EU opted then, as an alternative to that, to press for a border in the Irish Sea, which I think was unnecessary. And you've rightly posed the question, why now are the EU saying that 80% of the checks they imposed on the Irish Sea are no longer necessary? And I think that is a very valid question which they haven't given an answer to. So I think that we can find a pragmatic solution to this issue that avoids the kind of internal border within the UK. And I still believe fundamentally that the case for Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK is very strong. The UK is the 5th largest economy in the world. We do the vast bulk of our trade with the UK. Great Britain is by far our biggest market. We benefit substantially from being part of the United Kingdom. But of course, in the context of the relationships that are covered by the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, we want to ensure that those relationships are strengthened. And at the moment, the Irish Sea border harms the relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which is actually, as I've said, contrary to a core element of the agreement. Now, Mary Lou talks about majority rule in Northern Ireland, which is quite strange coming from Sinn Féin, since they have spent pretty much all of the last decades arguing against majority rule. And the whole purpose and point of the Good Friday Agreement was consensus politics, not one side imposing its wish or view on the other. And I regret that we see an abandonment of consensus politics when it suits Sinn Féin. I don't believe that the way to resolve the issues around the protocol is to dismiss unionist concerns, because frankly, that is not the way that we're going to resolve this issue. And I think Sinn Féin need to listen to unionist concerns, which are very valid and genuine concerns around the protocol. And we are engaged with the EU, we are engaged with the UK government on an almost daily basis now to try and find a solution so that we can move forward and build the kind of shared future that we want to see in Northern Ireland. But we need to resolve these issues around the protocol because they do fundamentally harm one of the key relationships covered by the agreements. Mary Lou says we should honour agreements we enter into. Well, Article 1 of the Good Friday Agreement is pretty fundamental for unionists when it talks about maintaining Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, and that there will be no constitutional change without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. And that is a principle that ought to be respected, and it isn't respected in the way this protocol has been implemented.
I'm going to ask just one more question of the panel, but if you have a question that you would like to ask, if you would just stick your hand up so that I can see you in the course of this next question, and I'll try and catch your eye, and hopefully we will be able to ask the questions that really matter to you. We've been talking a little about the Good Friday Agreement there. One of my colleagues, Sam McBride, wrote at the weekend that reconciliation now appeared to be not only in reverse, but that had become a popular stance, particularly with DUP and Sinn Féin voters. Do you think that's the case? Has the Good Friday Agreement, has mandatory coalition passed its sell-by date if it's no longer moving us towards reconciliation?
I don't think so, David, and just for the completeness of information, it's important to note that there have been checks in the Irish Sea since the 1800s. But we're moving on from that topic, so I won't dwell on that. No, I think we're at a really, really interesting juncture in Irish politics at a time when the world faces huge existential questions and crises, not least around climate, and then wider social justice issues, the poor south, the wealthy north, all of those things that are with us. And here in Ireland, we've come through a cycle of conflict. I think it's to everybody's great credit, and by the way, the politicians shouldn't try and hog this. As a people, to our very great credit, we have managed to create and sustain, at this point, a fairly robust peace process. And we maybe take that a little bit for granted. I'm going to argue that we shouldn't, and we should be appreciative and take care of that. The issue of the coalition in the north, the kind of unique set of governance arrangements remains necessary because we had generations of single-party rule, and we had a state that nationalists, Republicans, other groups found themselves locked into and disenfranchised from. And it's very important that we build on that platform. I'm a United Irelander. I passionately believe for everyone, and it doesn't matter where you come from, what your experience has been, your view on the past. But if you focus on the future, the very best idea for our island is reunification, to end partition, to end that scar, not just on our map and on our territory, but in our heads and in our hearts. And I believe that we can do that. We're not going to do it within the confines of the Assembly and the Executive, although it is important that they function and deliver on the bread and butter issues. And so, David, we've been advancing the argument now for quite some time that it's time for a citizens' assembly on unity. I mean, we've young people, students here today, I'm sure with all sorts of questions and ideas and perspectives and criticisms, all of that. We've a wider population out there who need to be actively engaged in debating out where we're at, where we want to go, how we get there, at what pace we get there. And then that's the thing that will drive reconciliation. There's no political party or individual who's going to hand this stuff down on tablets of stone. That's not how it works, and it's not how it should work. Because for the change that we need to be sustained, it has to come from the grassroots. So that's my strong belief. Is the Good Friday Agreement past its sell-by date? Not at all, not by a long stretch. And by the way, as we move into the process of constitutional change and reunification, there are central tenets of the Good Friday Agreement that will stay with us. So issues around citizenship, identity, we've actually settled those matters in the Good Friday Agreement, and I think we need to recognise that as well.
But you would want people like Jeffrey Donaldson and the unionist community, particularly in the north, to engage in that conversation around unity. How do you persuade them that a united Ireland would be a comfortable place for them when even last week you wouldn't acknowledge the existence of Northern Ireland or take time to reflect on 100 years of partition?
Well, we have actually taken very considerable time to reflect on the experience of partition, and we've been involved in events and discussion. What we will not do is be involved in any event that seeks to commemorate or mark, as though it were a solemn occasion, the moment of partition. Just bear in mind, partition was the single most violent act inflicted on our people. On threat of violence, our island was divided. I believe partition has been catastrophic for us as a people. I believe that empire is wrong, colonialism is wrong. What happened 100 years ago was wrong. So far from commemorating it or marking it as though it were, a solemn moment of advancement, we need to have the conversation around recognising not just the damage that was done, but how do we extricate ourselves from this? How do we move on? What's that process? And yes, I think unionists, and when I say that, I don't mean just the political figures. I mean regular people, and like you, and I'm sure like Neil and Jeffrey, you have occasion to speak, particularly at universities, so at Queen's or at Jordanstown or whatever the case may be. And it has been my experience always, every time I have been at those events, at the end, you get the chats with people who say to you, look, I come from a unionist background, I don't support your party, which is fine. I don't vote for you. That's fine too. But I want to talk about this issue because I don't like Brexit. I'm a European. I don't want to be caught between the Tories in number 10 and, kind of reactionary stuff from politicians in the 6-county state. And so there is that appetite for that conversation. So what we should do is just let that happen in a way that has structure. And I think the Citizens' Assembly is tried, it's tested, it worked to have the discussions around marriage equality, around women's abortion rights, the 8th Amendment. And I think it's the right methodology for the conversation to have, for politicians to play their part. But let the people have the conversation. Isn't that, after all, they're the ones that really matter.
Neil, what's the role of the Irish government in that conversation around unity?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're still talking about reconciliation, and reconciliation should be uncomfortable because it's not easy, but it's important. And it's important we go through events and conversations that make us feel uncomfortable, not necessarily the people we're talking to truly understand not only the different opinions, but more importantly, where there are shared opinions. And I think before we talk about citizens' assemblies, the role they play in this state are for when we're talking about constitutional change and when you're giving a very clear issue to discuss, as Mary Lou has alluded to. But before that, there's far more work to be done on reconciliation and breaking down emotional and invisible barriers across this island. Some of them are societal, but far more, it's the really simple differences. How many people from Clare go to the North Antrim coast on their holidays? How many rugby fans go to Ravenhill on a Friday night? How many of us would think to pop up to Belfast to do our Christmas shopping? These are the things we need to focus on. And the things that unite the three of us, and indeed yourself, David, on this platform, is that we traverse this island regularly, not just for our work, but for personal reasons and for family reasons. And perhaps we should focus far more on those elements right now. The Irish government has a responsibility to everyone on this island and should act on that, and it has done so in a very positive way, I would argue, throughout the Brexit process. But first and foremost, it is building that shared island, that shared Ireland. No one should go into a room and say, well, I'm not talking to them because Mary Lou's republicanism, my nationalism, or Sir Geoffrey's unionism is somehow a barrier at the get-go. So I think the Irish government has to play a very proactive role, a very positive role, and sometimes a very uncomfortable role.
Okay, any questions from the audience yet? Come on, be brave. Am I going to have... Yes, I see a hand up at the back in a white T-shirt. Tell us your name.
Hi there. Sorry, my name's Peter.
Hi, Peter. What's your question and who's it for?
First and foremost, thanks to the invitation to Banbridge Academy. I never thought I'd say this, but I actually sort of half agree with Mary Lou. Not something I normally admit to. My question's for Jeffrey, though. I'm a 26-year-old unionist from Northern Ireland, and our greatest concern as our generation is, at this moment in time, is not our identity always to, or our tradition to the United Kingdom. It is for our opportunities and our career progression. I work at Banbridge Academy with young people who want to go to university, want to progress their careers. And when you are coming out of a post-pandemic, post-Brexit, we've come out of a 2.5 year of no government, and then we hear that there is going to be possibly another stint without a government. Is it not a social responsibility to make sure that it is something to guide the opportunities and to actually stay and work for the young people in Northern Ireland and with the Irish government to create those cross-border opportunities?
Jeffrey?
Well, thank you for your question. And of course, I wouldn't be in politics if I didn't want to achieve those things. And it's not just the Irish government. Bear in mind that many of the opportunities for our young people flow from being in the United Kingdom. And therefore, it means working with our government at Westminster as well. But I'm more than happy to work with the Irish government on matters that help to boost our economy and enhance cooperation. But as I've said, at the moment, some of those opportunities at least are being undermined by what is happening in relation to the protocol. Businesses are being harmed. I, on a daily basis, get reports from businesses. For example, I had a report yesterday from a business in Newton Ards employing many people that they brought in a consignment of goods from London, so part of the UK, within our own country. And they paid hundreds of pounds in customs charges for the movement of goods from one part of the UK to the other, despite the fact those goods are not leaving the United Kingdom. Now, I just happen to think that that's wrong. It means that that business is now struggling to survive, which could mean a loss of jobs, including for young people who work for that business. So I am keen to ensure that those businesses do survive, that they don't have imposed upon them unnecessary checks that the EU already accept are not necessary, but haven't yet removed them. So I hope we can get to a solution, Peter, and that is what I'm working towards. But I also want to attract investment into Northern Ireland. This afternoon, I will be back in Belfast. I'll be meeting with one of the largest companies in Northern Ireland who provide opportunities for graduates and others in Northern Ireland, young people, to have good jobs, well-paid jobs. I'm talking to them about how we can expand the number of jobs that are available through that company in Northern Ireland. So this is an ongoing issue, and I accept entirely your point that what really matters to young people and to their families as well is that they've a decent future. And if I can, David, just go back for a moment to the point about reconciliation. I think that is very important. And we shouldn't hang around waiting for something to happen in the future. We should be working on reconciliation now. And I was disappointed when I attended a recent event and Declan Kearney, who's the national chair of Sinn Féin, said that reconciliation wouldn't come this side of reunification. Now, I don't think that is the way forward, David. I think that we need to be working on reconciliation now. At the service in Armagh last week, we heard from many young people, their aspirations for the future. And I think we should all listen to what those young people had to say, because they don't want to wait around for maybe years to come for reconciliation to occur. They want us as political leaders to be working on it now and creating the better future for them in the here and now, not some way down the road.
But if I can just pick up from where I think Peter left off, and it's really a question for all of the panel. Is there ever a way and a time for setting constitutional politics to one side for the greater good? For example, should this whole island have locked down as one, like New Zealand did during the global pandemic? There will be, I'm sure there are examples equally where we could look at Northern Ireland working closely with the rest of the UK. But are there times when we can find a way to do that for that greater good?
Well, absolutely. And actually, in the course of the truth is that we should have had a single island response in respect of COVID, and we advanced that case very strongly. And in fact, we also advanced the possibility of moving in lockstep with Scotland and Wales and England also. That didn't happen, and more is the pity. But there's a lesson in that, because Peter, you're right, you talk about coming out of not just Brexit, but in a post-pandemic world. I mean, which of us thought that we would live this experience? Do you know what I mean? Think about it, the most basic freedoms suspended for a long period of time, unable to move beyond your own home, bar very modest. I mean, that is mind-boggling when you reflect on it, and yet that's what's happened, and we've come through it. And I think we have an opportunity here to kind of reset, all of us, and I include myself, reset our mindset and ask ourselves some pretty fundamental questions. So Peter has raised the issue of the future and opportunity, and this is what I hear from young people, from people who would be Republican, National, or who don't have any particular politics, let's be frank. What does the world look like for you? What are the boundaries and the horizons within which you operate? And I think we need to offer our young people all of it. So one of the great strengths of being a European is that you can work, move, travel, enjoy the benefits of, being in Spain or France or wherever you wish to be. I don't think we should shut things down for our generation or the next. I think we need to keep all of that open, and that was the great horror of Brexit for me, is that it said to people, you have to choose now. You have to make the choice. Are you European or British? So it's no longer just Irish or British, or both. It's Irish, British, European. And to pit these things against each other, in my view, is absolutely wrong. And I think it's equally important that we, as Irish people, have the common travel area, that we have access to our neighbouring island. I think all of that is good stuff. But as a people who live on a small island, this isn't Australia, folks. This is a tiny little island, a small landmass with a small population. And we need to get our act together. And my view, and the politics I will advance, Peter, and you may not agree with this, or you don't because clearly you're a unionist, is that our best shot at giving the best of opportunity and horizon to our people is to do it in a united front and as a single, not just geographic entity, but political entity. We're missing opportunities by the dozen, economic and social opportunities. And can I make this comment? And then I promise I'll shut up, David, right? I remember during the debate on the repeal of the 8th, and we were out in a by-election. It was up in Tyrone, I think. And we were out canvassing, as you are, and we ran into a group of other canvassers who aren't nationalists or Republicans. I won't mention their party, but it was all young people. So we stopped and we were having the chats with them and so on. They were all wearing their repeal shirts. And I said, isn't that interesting? You see, for people who are 19 and 20 and 21, it was the issue that mattered. It was about people's freedoms that mattered. And actually the border was a technicality. And that debate wasn't just a debate in the south. That was an all-island debate. Same with marriage equality. Same with the big issues that really, really matter to us. And I think that tells us something really significant about this generation coming up, who I believe will change not just Ireland, but will make a huge contribution to change in the world. I have great faith in all of you. I just have to hope that we don't make a complete mess of it, that we hand over, a viable project to people who'll drive the victory home. So I'm very excited by that. I would like people to feel animated and empowered by a conversation about a new Ireland and a united Ireland, and to say, what does that need to look like for me? what's the win for the whole of society? And I think that's a very exciting thing. And I hope, Peter, that it's something that you and that people who come from a unionist background will start to, test and challenge from your own unique perspective.
Neil, do you think it's naive of me to suggest constitutional politics can in some way not be the dominant issue at times?
I think we all need to be realistic when we're talking about practical issues. And I'm minded of a story of Sir Geoffrey's predecessor, Ian Paisley, when he was an MEP. And whenever there was a vote on the Common Agricultural Policy or the Fisheries Agreement, it really didn't matter if he was a unionist. He was voting in line with every other single Irish MEP. And that's when we work collectively for the interests of all this island. And that includes maintaining the North-South institutions, because we talk about the opportunities for young people getting ready to do their A-levels in Banbridge Academy. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about the climate emergency, we're talking about places to live. That doesn't get improved by saying, well, we're going to ignore the North-South dimension until we resolve our issues with the East-West dimension. You have to continue to make yourself feel uncomfortable, to go out and to work and say we're disagreeing on the protocol, but at the same time we have to resolve issues, as you rightly said, in terms of our response to COVID, but more importantly, it's looking at the opportunities for the COVID generation. How are they going to get used to the new way of work? Are we going to be going into a hybrid model? How is it right that third level students have spent the last 18 months and they haven't had so much of a Freshers Week or as a RAG Week? They've lost so many seminal moments in life. And I think if we all work together and park the constitutional issue when it suits us, we can actually get on with the practical jobs that we're all elected to time-limited terms to do.
Let me take a moment and ask, have we another question from the audience yet? Yes, I see a hand at the back again.
My question's for Mary Lou. As you said, you say the way forward is for United Ireland, but has there actually been thought into what a United Ireland would look like? Is there a plan in place? Do you not feel like it's quite rushed? Is there have you put plans in place for solutions for problems that could arise before you do say that the way forward is United Ireland?
So, what I'm saying, I didn't catch your name?
Megan, yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question, Megan. So, how I think we need to come at this is to start at the start, which is usually the sensible way to proceed. I'm sure you'll agree. And we need to start the planning. Now, let me say this. When I'm asked generally about Irish unity, I get asked the following. What about the anthem? What about the flag? What about, a public holiday for the 12th of July, which I think is a good idea. So I'm happy. But we get into all of that. I respectfully suggest that's the wrong place to start in my head. Where I would start is with our health service. Because I think citizens need to know what happens when you need to see a GP. What's going to happen now? We've waiting list, a crisis and waiting list north and south. And some of that has been driven by the COVID emergency. Some of it is around resourcing in the NHS and resourcing in this system down here. So what I think needs to happen, Megan, is not to rush. I'm not saying let's gallop to the polls next week and have the referendum. That clearly would be, farcical. But what I am saying is let's not lose time now to start planning and discussing the practical bread and butter issues that matter. I think we need an Irish National Health Service. I think we need a universal service, free at the point of access. I also know that will require very considerable planning and an infrastructural and a resource basis, and we have to have a conversation around how we pay for it. So I also believe that we need the people, everybody, to be involved in planning that out. And similarly for education, and you have the ongoing debate, academic selection or not, the systems of, striving for excellence, but also striving for equality and inclusion. What does that look like in a united Ireland? I think all of you in this room have something really important to say about that. And so I go back to my point, and it's not to be preemptive about let's have a poll tomorrow. It's about saying very realistically, we need to plan for these things. The demographics on our island are very strong. We've got a very good, strong, young population, which is excellent. The demographics have changed in terms of profile and political view and so on. Change is happening, and we need to prepare for it now in a way that is inclusive and in a way that hears voices beyond all of us, if I could call us the usual suspects. So that's how I would plan to go about it, Megan. Yes, on a policy level, we have done and we do our best to make our positions all Ireland in their application. That can be really complicated, because it's two distinct jurisdictions, and you have some powers that are devolved to the north, other things aren't. So it's messy. But certainly I would start with health. If you were to ask me, what's the first conversation we need to have as an island people with each other? We need to know, how do we look after ourselves? How do we look after each other? How do we clear our waiting lists? How do we ensure that people can access GP care and speech and language therapy? And what's the workforce planning through our universities and our third level system to actually fuel that? It's great that we have McGee up and running. That's really, really good. But geez, we need a lot more doctors. I don't know if there's any medical students here. If you are here, I salute you. We need more doctors. We need more nurses. We need all of those professionals. We're short on all of them. So there's an urgency in this, Megan, to prepare for a unity poll and a united Ireland. But there is also a practical application now to make sure that our people don't suffer and wait for treatment that they were required. So that's how I would come at it, Megan.
Jeffrey, I wonder, could I ask you, if you are confident enough in the DUP, in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom, why not have that border poll?
Well, because I think, David, it would be very divisive. It would polarise the community in Northern Ireland. And, right now, I don't think we need to have that. I think that the majority in Northern Ireland want to remain within the UK. I think that is evident from all the opinion polls that we've had. I don't think there is a majority for change. And to be honest, we have many other priorities that we need to deal with at this time. Mary Lou referred to some of them, not least the health service, growing waiting lists. I mean, the NHS proved its worth during the pandemic, but clearly there's a lot of investment needed. We need to make changes in how the health service operates so that it's more efficient in how it delivers things. We do need more people, nurses and doctors in the health service. These are priorities. If you look at the support that Northern Ireland received from the UK government during the pandemic, not least in relation to the furloughing scheme that saved the jobs of hundreds of thousands of people in Northern Ireland at a critical time, that supported businesses to survive during the pandemic, and continues to provide that level of support. I mean, Northern Ireland receives a massive subvention from the UK government to help support our public services. So, I think, David, the case for the union is strong, and I will continue to make that case. I'm always happy to listen to those who want to make the case for an alternative way forward, of course. But I am a unionist, and I believe passionately in the union, and I'll continue to put that case forward. But the other thing that I think, instead of focusing on what would be a very divisive border poll, why are we not getting on with the business of building a shared future in Northern Ireland? I think the last year has shown, as Sam McBride wrote at the weekend in his article, that we have a long way still to go in building reconciliation, in bringing people together in Northern Ireland. And I think that too should be a priority at this time. I don't think we should push that down the road, as I've said. I think that we do need to look at ways in which we can build that shared future. But David, I believe also that means understanding our shared history and not being afraid to engage with our shared history. Mary Lou has talked about comfort zones. And yes, reconciliation does mean stepping out of your comfort zone and being in spaces where it can be uncomfortable. And I think we need to see more of that from political leadership. I recognise that I have a responsibility to do that, but I think it's also the responsibility of others as well. And when church leaders seek to bring us together for the purposes of building hope in Northern Ireland for the purposes of reflecting on where we've come from, so that we can then look at what a shared future looks like by learning from the mistakes we've all made in the past. I think that's a good space to be, and I hope that in the future, when people do try to bring us together to reflect on where we've come from and where we need to get to have those conversations in Northern Ireland, and then I hope that those conversations can go forward, because if we had a united Ireland tomorrow, it wouldn't heal the wounds that were and have been created within Northern Ireland by over 30 years of a very deeply harmful conflict that occurred, that has still left its mark. Those wounds are still real, and therefore, instead of looking to have referendums on these issues, shouldn't we be looking towards healing and reconciliation, healing the wounds of the last 40 or 50 years of our shared history, and then talking about what a shared future in Northern Ireland really looks like?
We've talked a bit about Brexit, the constitutional question, and the prospect for reconciliation or not. So I'm keen to widen this out a little further. Yes, right up front here I have a question. Gentleman in the hat. Okay.
The hat has value apparently for identifying. My name is Stephen Garland. I'm a postgrad here in Trinity in Innovation in Healthcare. And my question is I come from Granard in County Longford, which is only 30 miles from Leggy-Kelly, the border. I've grown up beside the border with very much an all-Ireland mentality. I lived the pre-peace process in the Triangle, in Coleraine, Portrush and Portstewart. So I have the experience of the pre-peace process when RUC were on the streets and they had targets on their back and all of those issues. And my question is, I'm kind of here for a different reason, but it's an all-Ireland issue, and that's why I would like to get it out there, is that I'm here for kind of the 20% of people that in Ireland, in young people, that are criminalised for a victimless crime every day of the week. Somebody's being criminalised for cannabis use, cannabis possession, cannabis whatever. And it's an all-Ireland issue. Northern Ireland is we have an imbalance in our treatment of medical cannabis, whatever. I'm here, I have my stick. I have PPMS, which is a type of MS. And tomorrow I will literally emigrate again and become Ireland's latest medical refugee. And that's a fact. And I go to Spain. I know 100 people in Spain, across Spain, from the Canaries to wherever, all there to access legally. They can access their cannabis, which is cannabis as a medicine. And so this is a real thing. It's north and south of the border. I've used cannabis in all this island, and I know the background of everything of this island and the complications of it. But it's a real issue, and people can be criminalised. In this room, we have all students, 18, 19-year-old. I'll give my age away and tell you that on the trip to Tip, the first one, I was at the trip to Tip and got a stop and search at the trip to Tip and ended up in court subsequently at 18 years of age. I'm now 50 next year, and I've been all around the year, but I've run into complications all my life, and everybody here every student has that possibility of having their life irreparably changed. So this is a real issue that I think has to be raised north and south. It's the same problem in Northern Ireland, and all the parties represented on the stage here are generally prohibitionists, I think. And if you're prohibitionist, you're pro-Kinahan. You're helping an illegal trade, and that's what needs to change. And this is north and south. We have the same issue.
Neil,
so I'd like to address that.
I love a curveball question. Cannabis wasn't on my expected list today, but there you are. Is this government criminalising people unnecessarily?
Look, I'm going to be frank with you, Stephen. Am I complete prohibitionist? Personally, no. I think there's method to a lot of your discussion. I think the scientific argument for broadening out the medical use of cannabis is valid. And I support that, and I have supported the efforts within the Oireachtas to liberalise that to an extent. Probably nowhere near as far as you think it should go, and probably a long way before it goes any further. Do I believe in the fundamental complete decriminalisation of cannabis? I'll be quite honest, I don't know. And I'm giving you an honest answer. I'm up for the discussion, I'm up for the debate, but there is massive concerns presented to us regularly by medical professionals, by the Gardaí, and much else. It's not necessarily a binary issue. It's very different the person who uses cannabis to alleviate chronic pain, chronic illness, the person who's 18 going to Fela, who's tried it for the first time and had a small quantity, and then the certain people that you refer to who make a very lucrative and very murderous occupation on the back of it. But I do think it is something that needs a more wider discussion. In society, the vast majority of people don't have an opinion because it doesn't impact them, or they don't see that it impacts them. And it's only when it truly impacts you that the discussion comes forward. And certainly, if there are measures, and I know it's been looked at by the Minister for Justice coming forward and the Minister for Health in the Oireachtas, I'm happy to contribute and keep an open mind to it. So I apologise for not giving you the binary definitive answer, but that's kind of where my head's at the moment.
So thank you for the question. And in terms of cannabis for medicinal purposes, you shouldn't have to travel, and you certainly should not be made to feel like a criminal for accessing that. And we've had a long debate and many, I mean, really, really awful scenarios, including for children who need medicinal cannabis to assist them either to manage pain or convulsions or whatever the case may be. So for me, that's a medical question. I've always been a bit perplexed as to why it's so complicated in terms of referrals and sign-offs between multiple consultants and so on to actually get permissions to have access. But I work from the premise, if you are dealing with illness, if you need something therapeutically, if that is the medical view, you should have access to it, and no, you should not be criminalised. On the wider question, I think it is clear that we need to now have a fundamental rethink around how we deal with the whole area of addiction, drug use, recreational and otherwise, but more importantly for me, the issue of recovery. I represent the North Inner City and other parts of this town. It's ground zero. It's where the 80s heroin epidemic started. It's where also some of these gangland so-called characters emerge from some of these parts of the city. The use of drugs and all of that is very complicated, and I'm conscious we're talking to a young audience, so there is a recreational element to it. But we have to be aware that there is also a very complex hinterland around criminality and big money and profit and disadvantage and so on. So I would not describe myself as a prohibitionist by any means, but I am a person who will not play into the hands of people who will profit on the misery of others. And more importantly, and actually most importantly for me, I personally would not consider the question that you've put a legitimate question around the issue of decriminalisation unless and until I feel absolutely sure that we have the supports, therapeutically and otherwise, for recovery. For when a citizen finds themselves in addiction, wishing to make that recovery, that they are supported. I can't think offhand the number of recovery beds and detox beds that we have right across this state, but I'm going to tell you, it's very, very low. So we need to deal with this in a holistic way. So like Neil, I'm not giving you a pat yes or no, but I am concerned that people enjoy their full freedoms. I'm not against people having fun and all of that. I'm all for that. More of it is what I say. But I am also aware that any drug can lead to addiction, can lead to chaos, can lead to real suffering. And then when that person finds that they hit rock bottom and they're looking to get out, we are so weak on the whole full recovery agenda. And that's my concern at the minute. But thank you for raising it, because I know it is an issue not just among students, but amongst wider society. The received wisdom is that we're losing the war on drugs, as it's called. I think there's substantial evidence that confirms that. But the question is, what do we do next? And we have to put people front and centre in people's health and well-being, and we need to take on these criminal gangs the best with every method that we have, and we need to get them out of our neighbourhoods where they're causing chaos.
Jeffrey, very briefly, is it even more difficult to address these issues in Northern Ireland because of the continuing influence of particularly the conservative evangelical churches there?
Well, I'm not sure that is the case, David. I think that an added factor you might have mentioned is the presence of paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland who exploit young people in dealing in drugs, including cannabis. But look, I'm broadly in the same place as Neil. Neil and I agree on many things, don't agree on all things, but on this, I think we're pretty much in the same space. We're prepared to look at the science. We're prepared to look at what medical experts say. I understand the point Stephen has made. Stephen, that is not lost on me, what you're saying. And I think we do need to look at the medical application of cannabis in a safe way, in a controlled way, and look at the science and see what that says to us. But I share Neil's concerns, and indeed some of the concerns Mary Lou also articulated around the exploitation of many people, not just young people, with drugs. And that is a concern. It's not just a concern, David, for evangelical Christians. It's a concern for many. I've unfortunately had to deal as an MP with many cases in my own constituency of young lives destroyed by drug abuse, and their parents, who may not be evangelical Christians at all, but are just mums and dads really concerned about young people, even young people still at school, who sadly are being exploited by criminal gangs, paramilitary organisations who deal in illegal drugs. I think we do need to look at these issues, as Mary Lou has said. I don't think we're being effective enough in terms of how we tackle the issue of drugs. But I take Stephen's point. The points he's made are not lost either on myself or other political representatives. This is something we do need to look at. David, I have to say at this stage, I have time for one more question. I'm afraid I will have to leave because I've got to go to the House of Commons to take part in Northern Ireland questions. So apologies for that.
No problem.
I have time to take one more
Let
question.
me ask, is there any burning question from the audience for Sir Geoffrey particularly? Okay, up front here. And I have a few more questions once we lose the DUP leader. Okay, tell us your name.
Hi, I'm Luke, and I'm a student here at Trinity. And I just wanted to ask, just in relation to, obviously the COVID pandemic has been raging a while, and do you believe, I suppose, that issues of identity got in the way of a unified response to COVID? Considering, obviously, that science doesn't care about your identity, and Ireland is an epidemiological unit. It's a single entity in that sense. So do you believe that that is the case?
Geoffrey?
No, I don't. Look, I don't believe that identity got in the way of responding to the pandemic. We've had good cooperation across the border, and that continues, by the way, on health-related matters. And I don't think the fact that we are two separate jurisdictions necessarily means that how the response to the pandemic was taken forward was a question of identity. As Mary Lou points out, there were times when unionists like me opted to take measures in Northern Ireland that were different from those in Great Britain. So, for example, I'm in London at the moment, and it is not compulsory to wear a face covering here, whereas that remains the case in Northern Ireland in many settings, that wearing face coverings is compulsory. So it doesn't follow that as a unionist, I just adhere to what is decided in London or Cardiff or in Edinburgh, or indeed in Dublin for that matter. I think we have to look as politicians at the unique circumstances of our own communities and decide on that basis and on a consensus basis where possible how we deal with these matters. So I don't think that identity, whether you're British or Irish, was a determining factor in how we responded to the pandemic. I think it is evident that COVID hit and hurt many people, whether they are Catholic, Protestant or other, whether they are unionist, nationalist or other in Northern Ireland. COVID doesn't discriminate. It sadly has left many people, many families shattered by the loss of loved ones, and that cut across the entire community.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And with that, I think we'll release early for good behaviour the DUP leader and send him to give Boris a hard time. Let's say thank you to Jeffrey Donaldson. I'm sure some of the audience might still have questions. We're fast running out of time, but we'll fly through a couple quickly. Neil, let's talk about climate change for a moment. The Climate Change Advisory Council wants greenhouse gas emissions cut by 50% by the end of this decade, but Ireland missed its 2020 target by 13%, and emissions only reduced by 3.6% last year. This government's miles off target, isn't it?
Well, it's not just this government, unfortunately, it's in the entire society, and it's down to the government to make extremely difficult decisions. We'll see the recommendation yesterday in terms of the carbon budget and what that'll impact. But this isn't optional. It's no longer, it is a climate emergency. This is something that has been pressing, and I think we do have the opportunity, and I look at the legislation that was passed a couple of months ago, and that is transformatory, and I think if that's where we focus it, and are realistic in what we can achieve, sympathetic to the needs of people in the population. But I fundamentally believe that this is a challenge we're up for. And I think if we do what we're meant to do in cooperation with our European partners, we can make a big dent in that. But I'm not going to pretend like I'm not disappointed in the returns in 2020 otherwise.
Mary Lou, the murder of Sarah Everard in London, of course, has highlighted the issue of the threat still faced by young women. I know that there are a number of students boycotting nightclubs across the UK and Ireland right now as part of a campaign for more protection against spiking of drinks. What more can be done, do you think, on this island to protect young women?
Well, I strongly believe that obviously girls and women and all citizens need to have a sense of their own safety and need the information, need to have a level of awareness just to keep yourself safe. But I'm very much against this idea that somehow as women and girls we have to take responsibility for the fact that there are others that would hurt or harm us. So there has to be, this conversation has to be with women and girls, but it has to be with men and boys as well. And you know, when we talk about looking after our kids, we say it takes the village to raise the child. Well, that doesn't stop just because you hit the age of 18 or the age of majority. We actually need to look out for each other. And we need the strongest of penalties and the strongest of sentencing. If somebody comes and does harm to you, spikes your drink, that simple act in itself, not to mention what might follow when you are inhibited in that way, well then they need to feel the full clout of society, of the law, and there have to be strong sanctions. And I am always struck when it comes to violence against the person, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, that, you know, our system puts less of a premium, less harsh sanction on that than when it's crimes against property. And I think that's wrong. I think you need to have the state, the law on your side, but we also need to look out for each other. And by the way, I was listening to people talking about this spiking of drinks. I would always have assumed that happens in a nightclub or it happens in, you know, late at night. But apparently the evidence now is that lots of times this happens in private parties. It happens in people's homes. It doesn't happen at 3 a.m. when you're off, you know, out and about on the town. So I think we need to have a conversation about it. Speaking as a woman, we need to be aware of our safety. But I'm not going to go around this life terrified out of my mind or, you know, having elaborate strategies to keep myself safe. I expect our men, our boys and our system to actually protect women, to protect girls. And so we need to have that full, and fair play to the activists for making their point so strenuously. I mean, that case around Sarah was absolutely beyond shocking. Absolutely shocking. And again, it's one of those pause points where systems have to go back. And I heard the commissioner say that they were going back and looking at systems here and checks and balances here. So violence against women, these kind of things permeate all of society. It's not limited to one class or one section of people. So we need to have our antennae up and we need to be alive to it.
I think we've time for a last question or two. If anyone has a question they want to ask. Any more? Yes.
Hi there. I'm Niall. What is the most extreme measure the Irish government is willing to put in to prevent climate change? This is our one planet. I'm 16. This is my future. Is going to be greatly affected by this. How far are you willing to go to meet your targets for the COP26, to meet your targets for 2030? How extreme is your actions going to be?
Yeah, well, obviously it's not one action. I think it's a combination of actions, and it's also the reward as well. So I think a lot of people saying, well, we need to ban this, we need to remove that, and I fundamentally agree. So one of the obvious ones is banning the tailpipe car, so you won't be able to buy a new unleaded or diesel car by 2030 in the States. It's fairly serious, but it's also rewarding to making sure that we spread out public transport, to make sure that's an option, to provide more funding for cycle lanes in urban areas, but also to move our public transport and our public utility fleet over to renewables completely. So that's why we see hydrogen buses coming on stream in Dublin. I think that's the key thing, but it's also to look for the penalties for those who are breaking the guidelines, the commercial polluters, for want of a better word. And I think if you look at all in a combination, we can get there. And we also need to, I'm very strong about this, we don't need to think climate measures are somehow always a punishment. There can be huge opportunity for not only for people to have a better lifestyle, but also for people to make money and have a very good occupation on the back of it as well.
I think one of the difficulties is that the system has managed to commodify emissions. So if you think about it, even in terms of the trading system, the emphasis hasn't been so much around, reducing the emissions dramatically. It's like managing a crisis, when in fact what we need to do is solve the crisis. So this might sound trite, and I don't mean it to, but we need to do the things that reduce emissions. I mean, a lot of the time when you hear about carbon budgets and climate action, you hear about carbon taxes as though that were the holy grail. The truth is that in the absence of alternatives, in the absence of public transport, in the absence of retrofitting, things that actually reduce emissions, carbon taxes in and of themselves won't change behaviour. They become a cash cow for the state. They become merely a revenue-raising instrument. And I think that has been a real problem with the political discourse around the climate emergency. We need to do a whole audit, and we need to go, the state needs to hold the ring on this, by the way, and actually needs to take the actions around delivering the big infrastructural projects. Many of them are listed in the NDA, the National Development Plan. But they're always on the never. We need to get better at delivering those infrastructural projects on budget and within reasonable timeframes. And we need to make people's homes warmer. We need to reduce energy consumption, and we need to bring people on this journey with us. This is, I agree, potentially a win-win, but I know when you talk to lots of rural people, they feel that the climate agenda is nearly something that will be done to them. That's absolutely the wrong way to come at it. So get away from management and commodification of emissions, an obsession with carbon taxes, which will raise revenues but will make poor people poorer, and actually start doing the ABCs, the basic things that we know work, that will actually reduce the emissions. That's where the focus needs to be.
Okay, one final question. You have about 1 minute each to answer this. We live in a very polarised world here in Ireland, across the globe, fuelled often by social media. In that context, can politics still be a force for good?
I think it has to be a force for good, and I think it is a force for good. And I think if you tear away the noise, the three of us have had a very civil conversation where we've disagreed each other on many things, and that's how it is. And it'll shock many that I've had lunch more times with Sir Geoffrey and cups of teas with Mary Lou than many of the people in my own party. And that's the way it always should be. And I think we allow people, unfortunately, who aren't involved in the political debate to try and pigeonhole it and say they're always rowing at each other. And it's up to us as politicians to prove it's not like that at all. We can disagree without being disagreeable.
I mean, there is a toxic element to social media commentary and so on. It's mad. And I think all of us have been, I've had my fair share of it. I have to confess, I largely ignore it unless it's a threat, of physical harm. But let's remember also, there's something very democratic about social media platforms too. And it has allowed campaigns and viewpoints to get an airing and to get a hearing that if you were relying on, no offense, David, but the kind of the mainstream media would get crowded out. And I think it's a very powerful set of platforms, particularly for younger people and particularly for people who wish to be activists. But there is that nasty, toxic, that's a minority pursuit. And I'm not going to play into the idea that everybody on social media is there attacking and vilifying. Some do, and we all feel that, and it's wrong. It's categorically wrong, irrespective of who's doing it. But on balance, these platforms are good, and not just for Irish people. I mean, if you want to know what's happening in Gaza, if you want to know what's happening in Palestine, you're going to find a lot of, or Cuba, or anywhere else in the world. If you're interested in science and innovation in climate, social media platforms are powerful sources of information and powerful tools to drive really positive agendas. Unfortunately, they can also feed abuse and conspiracy theorists and theories. But that's the nature of free speech, isn't it? And an open democratic society. On balance, I think social media actually feeds and can feed politics in a positive way.
And just before we finish this morning, we're going to hear a few words from the man who couldn't be with us, the Irish Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney.
I hope this isn't too highbrow now for everybody who's listening, but it's because we're listening to, because most of the people who are listening are young people at different stages. Just think about, your own responsibility as the most educated young generation ever on this island, and the awfulness of what many of your parents and grandparents went through, and just make a choice that you are not going to tolerate that kind of future for yourself and your children whenever you have them. And that's the starting point, to say, no, we are not going to allow that to happen. And then you've got to figure out the incremental changes that you can influence, whether it's talking to your parents or talking to your teachers, or asking the question, why am I not in an integrated school? Why am I not in an integrated school in Northern Ireland? Why is it that only 7% of young people in Northern Ireland share a classroom with somebody from a different religion? Why is that? Surely it's the place to start. We anticipated that when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, that actually integrated education would become, over time, the dominant approach to education, because it's such an obvious thing to do. So when young people meet each other, they connect with each other, they understand each other, they trust each other. Then they don't accept the kind of tribalism that sometimes follows when they get a bit older. And it was interesting. One of the senior church leaders today was giving the example himself of when he grew up in East Belfast, and he was living in a community that had both Catholics and Protestants and nationalists and unionists. And he was saying, what was interesting at the time was we kind of got along and liked each other on a superficial level, but we didn't trust each other. And I think that said an awful lot. And you kind of get that in politics too. In the executive, parties work with each other, they get along with each other because they need to, but do they trust each other? No, they don't, because they have to answer to their own communities. And so that's what I think the next generation of young people, North and South, by the way, need to bring to this debate. They've got to question some of these perceived norms of lack of trust, and they've got to say it's not good enough, And I'm a big believer in integrated education being one of the great sort of pragmatic solutions to that conundrum. Because if you're living apart, you're living apart. If you don't meet the person next door, why would you trust them? And you'll believe what your community tells you about them, as opposed to actually hearing it from them and talking to them and breaking down those barriers. So look, I always caveat what I'm saying by saying I know I'm speaking from from a different place in terms of my own upbringing, and in many ways a very privileged upbringing, without much of the strife or pain that many people living in Northern Ireland have to live with. And there's, I don't know, 40,000 people who were injured during the Troubles significantly. 4,000 of them were killed. It's a heavy burden to carry, but a 10-year-old in Armagh shouldn't have to carry it. And that's what needs to motivate my generation to make it different.
And you can download that interview in full on the podcast. The Good Summit's back after a break at 1:30. But for now, would you join me in saying a big thank you to our panel this morning, Mary Lou MacDonald and Neil Richmond.